What's good, everybody? It's your boy Big Nate. Welcome back to Big Nate's Book Reviews, home of the best book reviews. And today we have a very special episode, one that quite frankly I'm very nervous to do, but at long last I'm reviewing Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Such a special episode, in fact, that I'm wearing some new drip that my queen, my girl, hand embroidered for Christmas. So had to bust this one out. It's a big one. I got the cup of joe as usual. You already know I got that doobie. And without further ado, we smoking this one for Leo Tolstoy. If you got your doobie at home, go ahead and spark that extra fat because we got a big one today. And without further ado, let's get into the review. All right, so listen, I would love to stay and chat and have a little warm up here, but we got a very big book review, so we got to get straight to business. So this book was published in 1878, making Tolstoy a certified old head. And there is wide consensus across like literary scholars and popular culture, and honestly, more important, me, Big Nate, that Anna Karenina is widely considered to be one of the greatest works of literature which is ever written. And it's a big claim. And but I must say I absolutely stand by that. This book is a true masterpiece in the truest sense of the word. Just to put in perspective, so for instance, when William Faulkner was asked what are his 3 favorite novels, he said 1, Anna Karenina, 2, Anna Karenina, and 3, you guessed it, Anna Karenina. And Dostoevsky himself, another literary philosophical titan, when he was talking about Anna Karenina, said that as a work of art, it is sheer perfection. It made Hemingway's sort of like master list of the greatest novels. It's also just referenced constantly throughout modern literature, just off the top of my head. The Unbearable Lightness of Being, from Anna Karenina, I think they named their puppy like Karenin or some shit after that. The Idiot by Elif Batuman. It's just, you really don't have to go very far before you find some sort of reference to this book. And I find it actually very interesting to see what Tolstoy himself had to say about the book, because he said that it's his first real novel that the first true novel that he's ever written. And to put it into context, Anna Karenina was written after War and Peace. And I'm actually reading War and Peace right now. I actually just hit the 600 mark, which means I'm still not even halfway done, but it's fire. Can't talk about it here. We gotta stay on track. So even though he had already written War and Peace, he said Anna Karenina was his first novel. And that's because War and Peace he sort of describes as like this singular work of art. Like he's like, it's not a novel, it's like not an epic, it's not a historical chronicle. It's just, I think he said War and Peace was exactly what the author wished to express in the way it's expressed. Like it's just a singular work of art. Whereas Anna Karenina is very much like a truly conventional story. So just to even like get into what the actual book is about, it essentially follows the lives, and you could say like more specifically the love lives of just all these different characters in aristocratic Russia. So the premise of the book is that Anna ultimately has like this infidelitous relationship with her husband. But there's tons of other characters we get to meet, tons of other love interests and relationships and dynamics. The whole thing's like a literary drama. And like this theme of adultery and love in like aristocratic Russia, honestly, if I hear that description, it sounds like a book that I would never pick up on my own. Like frankly, the plot itself sounds boring. But for one, to me, that's my taste. But for one, the way that Tolstoy writes is just like, I will read some smut by Tolstoy the way that bro writes. But on top of that, he also just has so many, through these characters, he's able to think through and reflect and just play out on not the screen, like the pages, just so many beautiful themes about just like human life, just life, death, spirituality, the universe, God, the nature of love, the nature of people, society, culture, like literally the entire human experience, it feels like, is just contained in this book. And also, just for the record, I've decided that pretty much for that reason, if for that infamous question of how many books, if you could bring 3 books on a desert island, no question, Anna Karenina is one of them, just because there is so much life contained within these pages. It's one of those books that will be evergreen, that you could just constantly, it's one of those books actually where the more you reread it, I'm sure the more and more you would get out of it. So this is, because the book is so big too, I find it hard to kind of talk about in terms of a book review, but I figured the best way would actually be to talk about some of the main characters, because the characters are really, I think, what breathe life into this book, and they're the medium through which like these higher themes are shown. So up first, I'm scared, I really am, but up first, we might as well just get it out of the way. We are talking about Anna Karenina, who in the beginning of the book is presented as like this very she's basically like the full package. She is just absolutely beautiful, and she is intelligent. She's like, everywhere she goes, she's turning heads. And there's something about Anna which is like genuinely enchanting. And the quote that comes to mind for me actually is from Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment. And he says something along the lines of like, we sometimes encounter people, often just total strangers, who begin to interest us all at once, even before they have even said a word. And that really reminds me of Anna. Like in the beginning of this book, you can just see it happening with all the other characters in the book. They are literally drawn to her like a magnet. And you as a reader are too. Tolstoy does a great job of that. Like you are truly fascinated by Anna as a person. And so, you know, I'm kind of fast forwarding here, tons of good shit in the meantime, but we begin to realize at some point that Anna does have this sort of darker side to her. And I think one of the first scenes that this really comes out in is when she, at some point there's like this big dance. That's another thing about this book. So much of it is just soirees and dinners. And it's like that's where some of the most intense scenes happen, just at like these big social, aristocratic, fancy gatherings. But there's this big dance. And one of the characters who we come to know in the book named Kitty, she's sort of like this younger woman. And she, for one, as with everybody else, adores Anna. But she's also been talking to this dude, his name is Vronsky. And her and him are kind of like, they've been courting one another, so you could say. And Anna basically comes in and like swoops in and steals her man. And they like, also like a moth to a flame, Vronsky is just drawn to Anna. And they start doing these sort of like intimate dances. And at some point, Kitty's kind of watching Anna and realizes that she was drunk off of the wine of the rapture that she inspired. So Anna Karenina has this sort of vain side to her, and she really feeds off of being, I think, like almost like an object of fascination. And that's a theme that comes out and is revealed throughout the book. But as I was reading Anna Karenina, she more and more kind of reminded me of the Mona Lisa, or like the interpretation of the Mona Lisa, where the picture I think is just so famous because if you look at her in one perspective, she seems like she's smiling and it seems sincere and she seems like a kind and like warm-hearted person. But like if you just look or squint your eyes or at the play of the lights a little different, somehow the face shifts to being like almost sinister and seductive, and like there's almost like maliciousness beneath it. That's like, you know, the big interpretation of it. And it's like this superposition of those positive and negative aspects. And to me, that's very much what Anna is too. And at times it can just also like just on the turn of a dime, she can just switch from being like genuinely kind and sweet to just like malicious and cruel. And you know, there's like so many lines where it's like, you know, a wicked light lit up in her eyes, which a moment before had been tender. So she can just sort of from go 0 to 100. And the thing about Anna is she's enchanting, but the way that she does it, it's almost as if really people are being like cast under a spell. Because at this soiree where Vronsky and Anna are dancing, and Vronsky's like, this is the beginning of when he really starts to fall in love with her. Tolstoy describes his look as containing obedience and fear and despair, which is just like very interesting words to use for someone who's presumably falling in love with this woman. And on top of that, Kitty is like watching all this and she's describing Anna and she sort of thinks to herself, there's something alien, demonic, and enchanting in her. And like, just boom, bang your phrase. Like you can do so much with that. What I was reminded of when I heard that was just like the idea of the ancient Greek sirens, who are like these mythical creatures who are just beautiful, literally irresistible. And you know, if you fall into their orbit, if you fall into their spell and you actually go to them, they're like these grotesque harpy creatures which just like claw and eat you alive. And obviously it's not that drastic with Anna just as a character, but you know, that phrase alien, demonic, and enchanting, I think perfectly describes the Odyssean ancient Greek sirens as well. And the thing with Anna too is she's such an interesting character in terms of like her psychology, because there's times where it seems like she almost slips a little bit into insanity. Like there's moments where she's genuinely unhinged. And like one example is she's talking to Vronsky and she's talking about her husband, and she's like, he's not even a man, he's not a human being, he's a puppet. And he's like, if I were him, I would have ripped a wife like me to shreds, I'd have torn her to pieces. Like just starts tweaking out, and Vronsky's literally like, okay, you're not right, my love, you're not right. And there's so many moments where we get to see like the true and again the darker side of Anna's psychology sort of like just slipping through the cracks. And the thing with her too is she's not just like this sort of flat femme fatale character. She really has her own depth to her as a person, and we begin to realize pretty quickly on that Anna is somebody who is truly and like, you know, deeply depressed. And I think that's just a dynamic which continues to get worse and worse throughout the book. But again, we get these moments where that slips through, because at some point she's talking with her really good friend Dolly, who she invites, and at this point her and Vronsky are kind of together, and the two of them are living on the countryside, and Anna's describing, she calls herself unpardonably happy, and they put on this big show that, you know, she's just living this dream life. And in fact, Dolly, her friend, even gets jealous, and she's like, man, basically I'm married to a fucking dope, and I basically wasted all my years tending to my kids, this, that, and the other. And look at Anna, she gets to live her life fully. But there's a moment where just Anna really kind of out of nowhere is like, what do you really think of me? Because she's gone through this whole sort of infidelity ordeal, and she's like, just please don't despise me. I'm not even worthy of being despised. Like I'm just unhappy. If anyone's unhappy, it's me. And this is after she put on this big show showing that she, again, unpardonably happy, but now here she is just out of nowhere, the crack slipped, and now she's weeping before her friend. So Anna as a character is just fascinating. I'm not we're not even going to touch the ending, but that just adds a whole new element to, I think, how we should interpret her. And I think you really begin to sympathize with Anna too for her actions here when you meet her husband, who's another major character in this book, Alexei Alexandrovich. And one of the first things we see by meeting him is, Anna has just come back from the town where she's the belle of the ball, she's the creme de la creme, like she's hot shit. And she comes back to her husband who's like 20 years older than her and like kind of an older dude. And he's just, the first thing he says is some shit like, ooh, it's me, I'm tender as in our second year of marriage, and I'm burning with my ardor to see you. He's just like a total dope, super pretentious, full of himself. He's just a total cornball. And I think the more you get to know Alexei, the more you really do sympathize with Anna and her actions. And Alexei himself is just, to his core, he's really just like a sad, sort of pathetic man who is just, in Tolstoy, what he does through him is like I think he's like a character study of denial, not only with Anna and like that whole relationship and the whole course there, but also just someone who denies life itself. And one of the first times we get to see this, I think, is when he begins to have these questions. Once the signs of Anna's infidelity start making themselves known, he is actively trying to tune it out, but it does get him thinking like, he's like, yes, of course I trust my wife. But then he's like, for the first time, he questions himself, like, why should he trust his wife? And he realizes also, like Tolstoy literally says this, for the first time, he thought of Anna Karenina as an actual person with her own desires and thoughts in life. And the thought so frightens him that he hastens to drive it away. And that, along with all the other sort of negative things happening in his life, Tolstoy has a line, he says, in his soul, he closed, locked, and sealed in the drawer, basically his feelings towards life. And the thing is, he doesn't even realize that he's starting to invent things for himself to do throughout the year, basically taking on all this new work so as to not think and avoid essentially the things in that drawer of his soul, which grew more dreadful the longer they lay there. And eventually, as the book goes on, Alexei does have this sort of crisis moment with Anna, but also just his life in general. And Tolstoy describes it as if it were a man who had been walking on a bridge and never thought once to look below him and see that there was this bottomless abyss. And, at one point it's like waking up one day and the bridge is, ripped out from under you. And for the first time, you confront the fact that there is, again, this abyss beneath you. And he says the bridge was the artificial life that Alexei constructed. The abyss was life itself. So, and, I have so much more I'd love to talk about with Alexei. I think he does have, in a way, a sort of redemption. And again, you do find him pitiful. Like after this whole thing happens and he's really with his grief, he realizes that the only two people that he's closest with are his office manager and his doctor. So, and there's a lot of other stuff that we get to learn about, sort of like his younger days, you could say, that again actually make you turn, because I find him just unbearable throughout most of the book, but you really do actually begin to sympathize with him as a character. So all the people in this book are well-rounded in that sense. So, and then of course, now we have to talk about Vronsky, the man who's the infidelisand, as you would say. And Vronsky to me is just like, he's just like a simple, honest dude who at some point falls under the spell of Anna, and the two of them just slowly destroy each other. And I know it sounds counterintuitive that I called him honest, but his whole thing is throughout the book, he will never tell a lie. Like if you just ask him a question point blank, and he has like these simple rules that he likes to live his life and kind of reduces his moral ethic to. And in fact, one of the things that I think is interesting about Vronsky is the way in which he changes on account of Anna. Like there's this one scene where Vronsky and Alexei, through this, because they're having a rendezvous, but some kind of miscommunication, and they end up passing each other. And Vronsky is like really upset with this sort of morally. He's like, he puts me in the position of a deceiver, which is something I never wanted and do not want to be. And I think there's actually a lot of ways in which Vronsky kind of changes who he is on account of Anna, but he's an interesting character to me particularly because I think he's the person through which the theme of like romanticization most gets explored throughout this book, because Vronsky is like completely in love with Anna. There's actually a great line where he says something like, you know, she basically tells him, I think she has a man, something like that, and Vronsky is just begging for the right to be tormented. Those were his words, because just at least hope. Like, he's just helplessly, madly in love with her. But as the book goes on and, you know, they actually spend time like being together, there's a part where he says like he was much further from happiness now than when he had first followed her in Moscow. Then he had considered himself unhappy and that happiness was ahead of him, whereas now he felt the best happiness was already behind. And despite the full realization of just everything that he had been aching for, it turned out not to be a grain of the mountain of happiness he had expected. And Tolstoy has this, again, wonderful banger line where he made the eternal error that people make in thinking that happiness is the realization of desires. And the way that, just like in terms of the pure story and the subtlety with which it happens over this, you know, huge book, between Vronsky and Anna, their dynamic from, you know, just impassioned love to, you know, something like boredom, and then it just goes, you know, eventually it reaches the point of just full-scale resentment. And the way that Tolstoy describes that narrative is just absolutely beautiful. And so just last character, I mean, there's so many for real that I could talk about at length, facts, but one of the last characters I want to talk about, you know, if you read the book, I can't not talk about him, is Levin. And Levin is a character that's been interpreted as like semi-autobiographical for Tolstoy, but in the book at least, he's just like this grumpy, cantankerous, cranky ass dude. But, you know, once you get to more know him, he really does have like a heart of gold, and he's just he's very down to earth, against everything that's like artificial, and just, you know, overall solid dude. And one of my favorite scenes that I think is just so characteristic of him is this part where he's just recently got married, because he has a whole love arc too, and they're newly married, and he has a bunch of people over, and at some point there's this dude who's being a little too friendly with his wife, you know, like the kissing on the hand and the informal address, so all that kind of stuff. And, you know, at some point Levin goes to his friends Dolly and Stepan, and he's like, are you guys notice? Is this just me? Like, am I tweaking? They're like, nah, we notice it. And he said, okay, well, splendid, then I'm at peace now. I shall throw him out. And they think he's joking, but he goes to bro, and he says some excuse about like why he needs to go, like why this dude needs to leave. And he's like, oh, did something happen? Are you expecting guests? And he's like, yeah, actually I am expecting guests. And then at some point he's just like, you know what, actually no, I'm not expecting guests. Nothing has happened, but just I want you to leave. He said, you may explain my discourtesy any way you please. So I would love to talk about Levin more as a character, but he's the character through which I think a lot of these higher ideas like life and death and God and the universe and, you know, spirituality, he's the person through which a lot of those get explored. So we'll talk about that. We'll table Levin for here. And honestly, we got to move on. I'd love to talk about more characters, Stepan, Kitty, Dolly, but like I said, we got to keep this train rolling. And I think one of the first sort of larger themes that we can talk about with this book, of course, is love. And I think like the nature of relationships. And we've already kind of talked about romanticization, where it's like Anna and Vronsky, and we see this elsewhere as well, but they're sort of in love with the idea of each other. And once they're actually forced to be together, the illusion sort of falls apart. And there's even a line by Tolstoy where it's like Anna, every time he was meeting with Vronsky, was gathering up a more and more perfect version of him, which was impossible in reality. So, and I think that's very much what Vronsky does with Anna. But Tolstoy also talks about, like, I think the reality of what a good relationship looks like. And he describes it through Levin, and Tolstoy writes that Levin felt like a man who had, like, before been sort of watching this boat go by smoothly and happily and sort of like, you know, wants to be in the boat, and then ends up actually in the boat. And he realizes, like, okay, you're actually on water, and you have to always be aware of where you're going, and you have to row constantly, and your hands are unaccustomed, they get these blisters. And the whole thing, while very joyful, was also very difficult. And I think that's an interesting, you know, interpretation of relationships, because I think people can relate to the fact, like, if you have a relationship, even with someone like your family or your friends, or of course a significant other, there is a degree of like communication and compromise that needs to take place for, you know, for a long-standing relationship. So, and you know, it's still, even though it's difficult, it is still very joyful. And I think, you know, I think he's on point with that. And he has this great line, I think, just about true love, like the real union and marriage of souls. And he says, when he's writing about his wife, says he no longer knew where she ended and he began. And just the idea too of like the transformative elements of relationship, because Levin, like I mentioned in the beginning, is like very grumpy and cranky, but by the end of the book, he's literally, you know, picking unironically, and it would be corny if it wasn't Tolstoy, but he's like picking petals. He's like, she will, she won't, she will, she won't. And like when you as the reader you've known Levin, you've seen this transformation. I don't know, I got very giddy reading that part, and you've just seen him come do a full 360 or 180 actually. Otherwise, he'd just return back. But then there's people like Vronsky, who I think in the beginning of the book is sort of, for any of his flaws is, I think he's full of life and has all these aspirations. But by the end of the book, he has this line where he's describing his life not so much as needless as hateful to himself. So you just have the heights of, sort of ecstasy with Levin and his sort of like spiritual union. And then you have the despair of Vronsky. And then there's also just this question of what is love? Like there is the thrill and passion of Anna and Vronsky's infidelity. There's the more pure and wholesome love with Levin and his wife, who I don't want to spoil. There's, the tired and bored love of Stepan and Dolly. There's the love of friendship, like with Stepan and Levin. So there's all these different elements and forms of what love is. And I think this book is just, a beautiful exploration of that. And there's also some, I think, just banger lines about love in general. Like one of them at some point, Anna is talking to Dolly and sort of asking her opinion of things and, what do you think of me, basically? And Dolly's basically like, I really don't care about any of that. I love you. And when you love someone, you love the whole person as they are and not as you want them to be. So just a banger. And I think another one also by Dolly is, I don't know if that's her, don't quote me on this, but there's a line in this book where he says, I think if there are as many minds as there are men, there are as many types of love as there are hearts. And I think these are just like some absolute bangers. And I'm just scratching the surface here. And, we haven't even talked about the themes like life and death, which I think, again, really come out through Levin. And, there's a part actually where Levin he has a sort of existential crisis. And, he realizes for the first time that he's actually going to die. And he describes it, he had overlooked and actually forgotten the one small circumstance that everything he knew would come to an end. If not today, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, in 30 years. What difference did any of it make? And, Levin really goes through this period of existential despair. And there's another line in the book where he's like, just all of human activity and human history is just a little bit of mildew which has grown over this tiny planet. And we think we can have great things, thoughts and deeds. He says they're all grains of sand. So so he has this whole crisis there, but then he has, I guess you could say it is another sort of crisis, but on the other end where now it has to do with life. And he's talking about the it's the scene where his child is being born. That's just one of the, I think, a just fantastic sequence. And he's going through like this spiritual frenzy, and he realizes the same thing that's being accomplished here at the birth of his child is the same thing that was accomplished on the deathbed of his brother Nikolai a year ago. Only that had been grief, and now this is joy. But both of those things were holes through which ordinary life, through which something higher showed. They were these divine spiritual experiences for Levin, which I think evolve ultimately to like his cosmic existential crisis, where he says he's horrified not so much at death as life without the slightest of knowledge of from whence it came, where, and why, right? So he has this constant struggle between religion and science because he has these great mystical spiritual experiences, but then at the same time he can't square that with, for instance, with like scientific facts. But then he realizes at some point that he's still not satisfied with this. And it's like, yeah, like we have the laws of conservation and the laws of matter and all the scientific information and everything, but those don't actually answer the question fundamentally. It really just like sort of displaces it because where do you get all of that from? And he has just a great line. He says, in this infinite space and matter and time, he is this little bubble organism which has separated itself and lasts for a while before it bursts. And he says that bubble is me. And this is one of the things that he begins to realize, like at some point, because he has these spiritual feelings, he's constantly looking for miracles everywhere. Like he wants it to be true. Then he realizes at some point, the universe itself, he says, here it is, the only possible miracle surrounding me on all sides, and I never noticed it. And just the existence of anything in the universe at all, that fundamental mystery, that is the taproot through which he's feeling all these divine feelings. And there's so much more I could say about Levin and just like the existential journey of this book, but I'll kind of leave it there so we can talk about some other stuff because there's so much that I have to skip. Like Tolstoy gives a whole, I think, really a philosophy of art. He talks about like these critiques of intellectualism and specifically things like utilitarianism, where you're applying reason to like morality, where morality should be, really come from the heart. In fact, there's a great line where he says these sort of intellectual philosophers using like rationality to get at moral principles. He says they took it no more closer to the heart than they would a game of chess. And just great reflections on Russian culture and society at the time. And, there's just so much more that's contained in this book. And I haven't even talked about things like other elements of story like dialogue, because again, that's one of some of the great, I think that's where this book absolutely shines. Conversations in this book can seriously be like like, they feel like battlegrounds where there's victories and there's blunders and there's like defeats, and just with the most subtle like word, turn of phrase, even just like a physical gesture, it could just change the tide of the whole thing. And this book really is a drama in the sense that there are all these love interests and changing dynamics and deceptions and like these social situations, like some of the cliffhanger-ish parts where it's like you get all of these mofos, you throw them in a soiree or a dinner together, and you just let the sparks fly. And I think, honestly, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say you could describe Anna Karenina as like one of the most literary soap operas of all time. And just, you know, in closing, I'm gonna give this book, of course, an A+. Like, I do think it's up there with the greatest piece of literature ever written. And you'll see, if you just start reading it, it absolutely reads like butter. Like, it's very long, but Tolstoy is one of the few people who I kind of describe him as he's someone who I wish the books were actually longer, because he is just constantly dropping like these deep insights and observations about human experience. Like, the way I described it is, it felt like I was busting literary nuts like the whole time. And there are so many iconic lines in this book, which I haven't even mentioned. Like, the first line is one of the most famous in literature: all happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I wish I could have spent more time. I'm sure I already droned on way too long, but you know, and so like I said, A+. I have no critiques of this book. I will just, there's a couple things I'll say. One, because it's so long, there are points where it can kind of grow languid, if that makes sense. Like, nothing crazy is happening. But to me, I don't think it's any less good just because the writing is so fire. Like I said, I will read anything bro writes. And he got me right. The way I described it to myself was that it's no less pleasurable being in a lazy river than a water slide. So food to think on. That's just what Tolstoy got me doing. Imagine what it'd do to you. The final thing I'll say is just, if you're not used to like the Russian naming system, it can kind of be not even jarring at first, but just a little, like, put it this way, they got a page in the beginning that just has like people's names and their nicknames and like the lineage and stuff, like a character list. So, but that's 100% worth the effort and more so. I, of course, you know, highly recommend this book. Love it. I can't wait to revisit it, you know, at some point in my life. And again, it gets the official Big Nate stamp of approval as being one of the greatest works of literature of all time. So let me know what you guys think of Anna Karenina. I know you mofos have read it because you guys were on my ass about posting it. So let me know what you think. Follow me on Instagram at Big Nate's Book Reviews. Get to my second channel, The Big Nate Review. I talk about like current events, but like in a mythological, psychological, literary lens. Just get to the Big Nate Review. I've been dropping fire. And you know, thank you for taking the time to chill with me here, Big Nate. Happy New Year to everybody. And thank you for watching Big Nate's Book Reviews, home of the best book reviews.